kingdom of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and forever.
So welcome back. We've had a little bit of a break, which is not a bad thing. And now we gather in September in the fall. It's the first day of autumn, and it's about 100 degrees outside. So doesn't feel like fall just yet. I'm going to start with, we'll have for our prayer, the Troparion for the feast of the translation of the icon of our Lord God and Savior Jesus Christ, the icon not made by human hands. So this is going to be kind of the theme of this evening's webinar. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We bow before your sacred image, O gracious Lord, and beg forgiveness for our offenses, O Christ our God. For you, of your own free will, deign to ascend the cross in your human nature, to deliver from the bondage of the enemy those whom you have created. Therefore, we gratefully cry to you, by your coming to save the world, O Savior, you have filled all with joy. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, now and ever and forever. Amen. We have come to realize the extent of your victory, the inexpressible plan of your perfect incarnation, and to recognize this miraculous and unpainted icon as a banner of that divine triumph. With hearts full of love, we kiss it in homage and in piety. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So I decided to kind of follow a little bit of the liturgical calendar we're in, and also to begin with one of the themes that is, you could say, close to my heart, iconography. And one of the questions, I think it's a question which continuously is asked, is how did Jesus look, and how do we know he looked like this? And then, of course, I think the big thing is nowadays it's very popular to talk about how certain historical figures have been, in a sense, whitewashed. They've been made to look more European than they perhaps were. And of course, that's it is a very popular theme, because think about when you visit churches and parishes of different ethnic backgrounds, you'll find, like, especially with the season that's coming up, Christmas, you're going to find nativity scenes. And very often the nativity scenes that we find in the church reflect the ethnic background of the people who are members of that parish or that church. And that's not something that is uncommon, because I think from the Middle Ages, Christian art has tried, especially in mission lands, has tried to express a certain cultural connection between Jesus and the people to whom the good news is being brought. And so that is, definitely it is an important question to keep in mind, an important theme, because, people will bring it up. Inevitably, you will either hear it, mentioned by somebody, or it will be a conversation that even happens in places of fine art, in museums, where you might see images of Jesus who definitely is not Jewish and definitely is not Middle Eastern. Now, so that's one of the reasons. The other things I saw recently, or during the summer, I saw a number of documentaries by an art critic / historian who I absolutely love. I love to follow him because he really is passionate in how he expresses himself about art. And he is also a little bit controversial because he does speak from a position of an art historian. So he is not a theologian. He is, when he looks at religious art, very often he does make a connection to, the biblical text, but he is not using art as a way of expressing his own faith. He actually, as most historians are supposed to, remains rather ambiguous about his own faith, and hence the connection to the works that he's looking at. His passion there, is really about the art more than about faith, through art. And so that's something that to keep in mind, because while there are some excellent resources and videos like this from the late Sister Wendy Beckett from the UK, who was an art historian and critic, but she was also a nun. And so when she spoke about the images that, and especially the religious ones, so she was very passionate in a different way, because there was also a deep faith that she literally wore on her sleeve, because in her television programs on the BBC, she was dressed in a habit. So there was no separation of, faith from art. And so she presents in a different way. But this man, his name is Waldemar Yanushchak, and he is a Brit of Polish descent. He comments about a lot of different art, not just religious art, but really does a wonderful job. And one of the things that I remember seeing during the summer from him talked about Christian art of in the transitional period between Jewish Christianity and then Christianity among the pagan converts to Christianity. And so he got a little bit, he talked a lot about Greek gods, and especially Apollo, and how Jesus had become kind of an Apollo figure in the early church. And, and it's something he when he says something, so he also proves it. So he shows images of both Apollo and Jesus from about the same time that are remarkably similar. And so, if there's one thing that we can understand about our faith as expressed in art, is that there is a continuity. We're not just looking at, here Christianity begins and everything that happens now is original. There is a lot that we build upon, and not only from the Jewish tradition, but also from ancient Egypt. Remember things like the halo, the position of the figures that stand, looking out of the images. That's borrowed, taken from ancient Egyptian art. And so there's nothing that we can say that would be particularly wrong with that kind of a development, where pre-Christian cultures were indeed baptized. and different parts of those cultures and their spiritualities became a part also of Christianity. I do recommend him. He is very entertaining and very lively. Fundamentally, I'm going to focus on, I think most of you remember that in the 90s, so this is already ancient history. In the 90s, there was a brief courtship between the church and science in the matter of the Shroud of Turin. And the church, after many decades and indeed centuries, had agreed to let the shroud be analyzed scientifically using not only analysis, microscopic analysis, or biological analysis, but also using specific instruments that might help in the dating of the shroud. And it was considered rather groundbreaking because it was the first time that something like that had been even considered. And so what was done was small, very tiny pieces of the shroud, of the actual cloth, from the edges was taken for carbon dating. And carbon dating is a process that is very accurate, and it can really help to ascertain the date of the shroud. And so a couple of, I think there were 3 laboratories that were involved. Each one received a piece of the shroud, a tiny piece, but enough to carbon date, with the understanding that carbon dating, the little piece that is sent, ultimately gets destroyed in the process. And so it is not then returned to the church. And so the agreement that was made between these 3 laboratories and the Vatican that ultimately permitted this, the agreement required that the laboratories do not share information. And so they were supposed to communicate directly with the Vatican and not amongst themselves. One of the reasons for this was that the laboratories and the people who worked in the laboratories, some of them already had an opinion about this. And so the scientific method was, not exactly pure and completely sincere, because they already thought, even before the analysis, that the shroud was a fake. So it was important that they would not share their findings with each other, to make sure that in case one of the laboratories dated it differently than another laboratory, they could see then if there is actually a discrepancy, or if somebody, wanted to mess with the results. And unfortunately, the laboratories, not only did they communicate amongst themselves, sharing the entire process, but they also leaked the information. And so the media already got the information that had been gathered through the process. And so the whole process became rather ugly, and it became obvious that the intention was to disprove the claim of the church in regarding the Shroud of Turin, and because of that, the reaction of the church was to close. They cut off the relationship with science. Now, for some people, this has become, okay, this is the final decision. For other scientists who have been involved in various analyses of the Shroud of Turin, this is just the beginning, because the dating of the Shroud has pinpointed a period in history where the Shroud was within a fire within the church. And so the carbon that was detected in the fibers was actually from that fire, still leaving the possibility that the actual fibers are older. A part of the shroud was burnt. And it is when you see the shroud, the photographs of the shroud laid out, so you see a number of holes that have been patched. So they're kind of shaped out in like triangles and squares. And so those were areas which were burnt, not by fire, but by the melting of the case which held the shroud. And so, but that of course created carbon that would affect the dating. So really the idea of the shroud is still out there. It has not been resolved. And one of the things that we see is that there is now, again, an interest in finding out what this artifact is. One of the issues with the history of the shroud is that we know about its history mainly from the Middle Ages. So there is what we could say historical documentation of the shroud that we can find already in the 13th century. And we can also see that information then develop in the 15th century and 16th centuries. And so the shroud becomes then much more visible. But what about the early part? Because that's the big question. It's like, okay, if it's 800 years old, then it has nothing to do with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And so how can we discover how far we can date this relic through the tradition of the church? And so that's what I'm going to look at this evening. The realities, and instead of going like backtracking, I'm going to go just straight to the time of Jesus and the events that are around his burial and resurrection. There are a number of facts, a number of realities that are difficult, I think, for us to understand about the world Jesus lived in. Jesus lived in a world that was self-contained. It was very Jewish, very observant and religious, very legalistic, and it was under the watchful eye of the Romans. But there were the realities of Jesus within his time were different than what we would understand today. Firstly, the Jewish worldview, especially in the Holy Land, was based on concepts of religious purity. And there was a clean line that was drawn between that which was kosher and that which was treff. Kosher meaning clean, treff meaning unclean. For us today, we don't really have ideas of that. we don't really think of things as being clean and unclean, at least not in a spiritual sense. And so it's difficult for us to imagine an entire life that is based on these kinds of concepts that distinguish clearly between what is clean and unclean. One of the realities that we see within the gospel tradition expressed quite clearly is a faithfulness to the law. And the law dictates all of the different details of Jewish religious life. Lived at home, lived within the synagogue setting, lived around the temple. And so certain laws are very easy for us to understand because we know more. So for example, the washing of hands before meals. That's something that is sanitary, something that makes sense because we know so much more about germs and the spread of illness and disease. In Jesus's time and before Jesus's time, these laws did not have that kind of a connotation. It could be, we could say that perhaps someone did have an inkling about, it's better to have clean hands, but the science just wasn't there at this point. Now, with regards to these laws, there were also very specific prescriptions for a number of events within one's life. And that, of course, is how to interact with the body of the deceased. So, according to Jewish law, one could not come in direct contact with the body. The body would be prepared by people who were given that responsibility specifically. And even those who were charged to carry the body, from the home to the cemetery, they were, as I said, chosen from within the community. That was their job. But one would not touch the body. See, so remember from the Gospels, remember when Jesus comes in contact with the funeral procession that is carrying out the young man, the son of the widowed mother from Nain. And there is, within that gospel passage, there is that one phrase where he touched the litter and the bearers halted. Because, now that we see that as a very emotional charged moment, but it was also a scandalous moment. Because by touching something that was associated with a dead person, now he would also be considered impure or unclean. And so the idea of impurity around the burial of the deceased was something that was very important. It was still the duty to have the body prepared properly and buried in a way that was consistent with Jewish law. So that was something that was important also to keep. I'm going to go now to the text from the Gospel of John that speaks specifically about the burial of Jesus. Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. Then they took the body of Jesus and bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. This is the first time in the gospel tradition where we do hear about some of those prescriptions of burial being followed and kept. And of course, very importantly, since we are moving into the history of the shroud, we hear about the body of Jesus being wrapped in preparation for burial. The next time when we will hear about the shroud or the linen that is used to wrap the body, it will already be on the day of resurrection. And following in the same gospel passage, the next chapter, John 20, we read here this unusual little detail. After the women disciples came and told the apostles that Jesus had been risen, we read the following. Peter therefore went out, and the other disciple, and were going to the tomb. So they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter, and came to the tomb first. And he, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen cloths lying there, yet he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb, and he saw the linen cloths lying there, and the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded together in a place by itself. Now, that's a lot of information about the wrappings. And so one of the questions, these are the little, I think, hints that are in the gospel tradition to give us a little more information. So firstly, there is the theological understanding. Why is it important to mention about the wrappings being there in the tomb? Well, had Jesus's body been stolen, as we read in the Gospels, we read that the religious authorities created that lie. So had his body been stolen, they would not have unwrapped his body. His body would have been kept, completely wrapped up. Meanwhile, and this is not only because of just the practicalities, but also because, again, even those who were there guarding the body, all of those who were the apostles, all of those who allegedly might have stolen the body, they would have a great concern about their own purity and impurity. So coming into contact with the body directly would have been something culturally difficult. It would have been a taboo. And so that detail is there in the gospel specifically to indicate that he was indeed risen. The body was not just stolen. And then, of course, if we're going to talk about the image that is on the shroud, so then we know that already at that point, the image of Jesus's body had to be on those cloths. Because everything there, everything that we read about the resurrection talks about light. And so the angels that are there at the tomb are in dazzling white robes. And so even then the cloth that is left there must have been already dazzling because of the resurrection of Christ that happened there in the tomb. But the idea, so we're left in the Gospels then with this place. We see where the cloth is, and it is, indeed, it would be the cloth that is used to wind around the body lengthwise. So it is not the cloth strips like a mummy would be wrapped, but rather it would be wrapped from head to toe, front and back. This cloth probably was taken by one of the apostles. And in the gospel tradition, so John is the one who makes most reference to the burial cloth. And so possibly it is he who took it, because the realization of the resurrection would have been, I think, something of great emotional, it would be overwhelming for them. But even though they would have the relic could still not really be used as something that would be venerated. See, none of these items from the death of Jesus become a focal point of veneration in the church until hundreds of years later. And a part of that must be the cultural realities, where the understanding of items associated with the burial of a deceased person, where that would be taboo. That would be something that would be criticized. Then add to it the reality that somehow inscribed into that cloth is the image of the body of Jesus. And that hits another taboo reality. It would be considered an graven image. And one of so you would not be able to appreciate seeing that face of Christ as someone who is living within a reality of Judaism, and that image is not something that is common or acceptable, and it would be interpreted possibly even as something demonic, because it was not a part of the Old Testament. It was something that was not acceptable, something that was not kosher. And so the shroud then begins its history, biblically speaking, in a reality that is very unfavorable to it. And so then I think, and this is, the early church has differing understandings when it comes to what happened with the burial clothes of Jesus. There is, perhaps in reading the gospel tradition, so there are these hints. So John speaks about the burial cloth a little bit more, and he speaks also about a cloth used to cover the face or the head. Then we see also mention of the shroud in Luke. And this is on the first day of the week at early dawn, the women went to the tomb. It goes on, and it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them, who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home wondering what had happened. So only Luke mentions burial linens, and John gives the most information. But then So this could be a little bit of a hint that points to the existence of this relic in the midst of the community. The early church doesn't really have any clear opinion on this because the presence of a relic like this would have made many of the early Christians uncomfortable, especially those who are coming from Judaism, because it has that kind of it's a double whammy. Not only is it something associated with death and burial, but it's also associated with an image. And the images that, today when we go to synagogues, you can see beautiful paintings, stained glass windows, and you can see images. But in the time of Jesus, that was very taboo, especially those who lived in the Holy Land. They considered themselves to be pure in the observance of the law, and the use of some sort of even symbolic imagery, like in astrology, for example, was considered to be the influence of the Gentiles. And so, and many synagogues did have problems with this. Synagogues in, Alexandria or other parts of the Roman Empire. So yes, there was some influence that came in the art that was used to adorn the synagogue. And it was a source of great criticism by the rabbis who lived in the Holy Land. And so there wasn't really, because of Christianity's position as coming out of Judaism, and then also the realities of being associated with the Holy Land and with the most devout part of Judaism, the early Christians were just not equipped to defend the presence of this relic amongst them. And so where do we go? Now, usually when we talk about religion and faith, I think the most important aspect of faith is intellect, that we learn through thinking, through our minds, that faith that is emotional is not as strong as faith that is intellectual. So when you know God, when you learn about him, you have a closer and more direct and real connection with what is the faith of the church. Whereas when we depend on emotions, churches are full of emotional Christians, for like Christmas and Easter. They come, they get their fix, and that's good for another year. Emotions are fickle. People who, primarily have their relationships based only on emotion, when things become difficult, it's easy to turn off the emotions. It's easy to drift apart. And so, that's why catechism is so important. Continuing education, you don't graduate from catechism. You continue, it's a lifelong process. And so I'm just kind of framing that at the beginning, but this is one aspect or one part of history where we may have to go the emotional route. And the church affirms it in some way too. If you think about it, so discovering or finding the empty tomb, the angels that are saying that he is risen, the women who are bearing witness to this too, And so inside the tomb, inside the cave, there are these pieces of cloth which are not like, they may be stained, but they are not like sullied or bloody, or in that kind of a gross, disgusting way, because they are also affected by the resurrection. And so seeing those cloths that are there at the side, what would one do if one was an apostle coming there or a woman coming there? One would take a souvenir. You would go and pick it up. And I think especially when it comes to like John. So John would take that, and who would he give it to? He would give it to Mary. And and I think those of you who are mothers know that. I mean, you have a tendency of saving all different kinds of things from your kids. Some of those things are very embarrassing and gross to your kids, but you still save them. And I think this is where that kind of there's that space for emotion, because after all, at the foot of the cross, there's that very charged and emotional exchange between Jesus and Mary and John. And so, there is room for emotion. And Mary didn't take this, or she wouldn't have taken it as some, something that she would share with the church. There wasn't, we don't know anything about that. And actually the reason why it's so hush hush, there are other things are spoken about a little bit, but the reason why this is not spoken about is because of the religious and cultural stigma that a relic like this would have. And so it would have been kept then by Mary and preserved that way. Now, there's a couple of, I said in the Gospels, there are little tidbits or hints that show us perhaps there is more to be understood. So this here is from Acts of the Apostles, and this is one of those interesting texts which might be a hint. This is the vision that Peter had in the city of Joppa, which is Tel Aviv today. Peter went up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour, and he became hungry and desired something to eat. But while they were preparing it, he fell into a trance and saw heaven opened, and something descending, looking like a great sheet, let down by 4 corners upon the earth. In it were all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air. And there came a voice to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "No, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And the voice came to him again a second time, "What God has cleansed, you must not call common." This happened 3 times, and the thing was taken up at once to heaven. Now Peter was inwardly perplexed as to what the vision which he had seen might mean. And equally, everyone else is perplexed, because this is what some have said. In order to have that kind of the church be conscious of the fact that this relic is present within the church, that there are these little hints that are concealed within the gospel, within the Acts of the Apostles. Because think about it, this vision of a great sheet that descends 3 times from heaven. So it's like, there is no, it's not a talus, it's not a prayer shawl, it's not some giant divine tablecloth. There's some reason for it. See, because the church the apostles would have been aware of this relic. They would be aware that it was, in Mary's hands. And so, perhaps this is what we're looking at. We're looking at a little hint that makes sure that we don't forget that this is still present. Now, in the Apostolic Church, we see a slow transition that is occurring from Judaism to Christianity. Now, when I say slow, I'm talking more about the fact of generations. We today, we don't have the same concept of generations. Think about a 20-year span and you have another generation, children, 20 years more, grandchildren. And so, although we can say that while there is about a 100-year period of transition, or let's say 90-year period, you're talking about, a good 4+ generations. And so it's a slow transition period for them, but for us it would be considered a rather quick transition. What we see is a church that is growing out of Judaism. So it's not a church that is cutting itself off of Judaism or changing itself, but rather it is seen as an organic growth and development. For Christianity to be Christianity, Judaism is necessary. It is the history of the church. It is the reality of Jesus. Now, the followers of Jesus, they're called Christian. What does that mean? So we read this in the gospel, in the Acts of the Apostles, but there is within that name, there is a lot that is held, because they could be called Nazareans. That does occur. They could be called, a number of different other names, but specifically the first name that is directly associated with them, and hence also a name that they call themselves, is Christian. It is because Christian comes from the Greek word Christos, which means the anointed one, which in Hebrew is Mashiach, which in English is translated Messiah. And so they are directly growing out of the messianic hope of Judaism. The other thing that we also find in this period of transition is that the early Christians coming from Judaism, and even those who had converted, so they understood that the 248 commandments of the Torah, the prescriptions of the law, had in the Messiah, in the person of Jesus, the Messiah, had taken flesh and form in the 248 bones of the body of Jesus Christ. So things are changing. Things are going from Torah to the living lawgiver. And hence also the tomb is no longer the place of sadness, corruption, decomposition, and permanent death. But rather the tomb has now been renewed. The tomb is now the tabernacle. The tomb is now life. Now, these are concepts which are going through the minds of the early church because they're a part of the process. We find these themes echoed in some of the early Christian fathers, especially those associated with the city of Alexandria. In Alexandria, there was a very lively discussion about faith and Judaism between different fathers like Origen with the Jewish religious leaders who were also very well educated. And so these themes are not things which are happening only in the Holy Land, but they're part of kind of a whole self-evaluation of the early church and figuring out continuity. So recognizing the past and that where we are in the fulfillment of that continues or flows out of the Old Testament and out of Judaism. Now, there are other signs of this transition in this period. So in this period, I'm talking about specifically from the time of, we could say, the Council of Jerusalem. So the apostles gathering together in Jerusalem in the year 50 to make decisions about religious observance as being either required or not, Jewish religious observance, as being required in the process of becoming a Christian. And so it goes from about 50 to about 130. In the 120s, we begin to hear about the synagogue leaders struggling with the presence of Christians in the synagogues, and the rabbis make decisions legislating that Christians would no longer be permitted to participate in synagogue life. And so you could say that by 130, that transition from Judaism to Christianity was complete. But the other signs that the church saw as emblematic of transition was, for example, the tearing of the temple curtain. So when Jesus died, the temple curtain was torn in two. The curtain was what is around the Holy of Holies. In some churches today, you'll notice that they have a decoration within the sanctuary, so around the altar, that may be reminiscent of a curtain because it's taken from the temple in Jerusalem. And so that curtain was woven as one continuous piece of cloth. So it had no beginning and no end. And so it being torn is a very important message. It is taken, interpreted by the fathers as being that point of separation between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It is taken also as that point where you could say that the covenant of the Old Testament, which is tied to the temple in Jerusalem, that covenant is no longer valid, and that now everything is points to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross and his resurrection. Now, the early Jewish Christian church saw the temple, the tearing of the temple curtain as being a being that occasion where separations are not present anymore. Because there was a separation with the temple between what is holy and what is not holy, what is divine and what is human, what is clean and pure and what is unclean. It was that separation was that curtain was the separation between divinity and humanity. That now that the curtain was rent in two, there is no longer that need to separate divinity from humanity, because in Jesus, divinity and humanity are united. There is no need to separate that which is unclean from that which is clean, because now in following the law of Christ, we have a clear model of what is good and clean and appropriate. So we no longer have to obsess with the details of impurity. And so that is another point which becomes quite important. At the same time also, just as since I mentioned the Council of Jerusalem, which is the model of ecumenical councils, gatherings of bishops, the USCCB, that it sets the standard and the model of how the church leaders are to come together and make decisions for the church. At that Council of Jerusalem, so of course also what was agreed upon was that converts to Christianity would not need to become Jewish first. They would not need to be circumcised, and they would not need to follow the law from the Torah. It creates, a bit of a change in direction, but it's only because they understand that this is now the organic growth, that now that the Messiah has come, now there is a reorienting to him and to follow what he teaches. And of course, we know from the New Testament that he did have many objections to how the law was used among the people of Israel to stifle religious life. And, remember, he was criticized for performing miracles, on the Sabbath. So that was not something that was, it was something that, although the apostles made that decision, it was clear from Jesus's teaching what his own understanding of law is. Now, but returning to the burial cloths. So the realization is that the cloths left in the tomb and mentioned in John and Luke must have already had that divine image imprinted on them. It was, in a sense, a message from heaven inscribed on linen cloth. In the resurrection, the impurities of blood and death and burial and bodily corruption were now gone. The cloth, because of the resurrection, is purified. It can be assumed that Peter and John took the burial cloths, but it is not mentioned in the accounts. However, one of the, hints that we see is that the cloths are not mentioned by the soldiers who went to the high priests. Remember that the guards who were put there were not Roman soldiers, but rather were from the local populace. They were the guards specifically attached to the high priests. And so had the cloths been lying there, they would have made reference to them. The fathers of the church also picked up on this detail of the missing cloths and saw in it some sort of a message, although they themselves were unsure. Remember that the fathers who, even fathers we know of, Saint Basil the Great, John Chrysostom, Augustine, for them, this shroud of Christ was still something that was not well known. It was something that was a bit of a mystery in the early church, because they didn't completely realize also the way that Judaism looked at this reality. But they did mention some of these little hints as being signs of something. But then the question remains, so where did the shroud go? Where did the cloths go? We don't know for sure, because there is not much information that is provided other than the mentions in the Gospels. But we can assume that the cloths were brought to Mary, and she would have preserved and kept them as only a mother could do. Talking about hints, we have a text that is from the 6th century in the manuscript that we have. And it is written in the Georgian language. Georgia is a part of the Asian steppe next to Armenia. It is one of the first countries, one of the first kingdoms to become Christian. And so we have this Georgian text from the 500s that is a translation of an earlier text that is probably Greek or Syriac. And usually before it comes to Georgia, so this has to be, if that's 500s, so this text is maybe 400s or even a little earlier. It gives us an interesting view into what potentially could have been the reality. So I have here an English translation of a passage from that text, and it is a surprising text. So Mary had received it, which is the cloth, from the hands of God himself, and kept it with her at all times, so that she might always be able to contemplate the wondrously beautiful face of her Son. Each time she wanted to adore her Son, she stretched the image out to the east and prayed before it with her gaze on her Son and with open, uplifted hands. Before the burden of her life was finally taken from her, the apostles carried Mary on a stretcher into the cave. In this cave, they laid Mary down before the face of her Son. And so it's a very, mysterious text, but it also shows that this was present, this thought of Mary having this relic was something that was present within the church. So it's not just about, us making something up, but rather that this tradition has its roots in a certain reality, something that does seem to make sense. Now, this treasure, this relic, that was kept secret and hidden for religious and cultural reasons would have remained in the family. because this was something, as I said, still rather unusual. Who do we know that is Mary's family? Mary's family is first and foremost Saint James, the apostle, Bishop of Jerusalem, the one who is referred to as the brother of the Lord. And then there is another apostle who is a cousin, and that is Saint Jude Thaddeus. Interestingly enough, if you've seen pictures or statues of Saint Jude, so he's holding on his chest a medal or an image of Jesus. See, that's a hint. That is associated with him from the very beginning. Saint Jude is mentioned more than any other apostle when it comes to the images of Jesus Christ. And he is specifically the one who is sent, according to tradition, to a tiny kingdom in Asia Minor that is called Edessa, a kingdom that was only 370 miles north of Jerusalem. After Jesus's death and resurrection and ascension, Jude was sent to that region, and specifically to a king named Abgar. Abgar had a relationship with Jesus, and interestingly, so that is preserved about Abgar, is preserved in the history of the church by Eusebius. Abgar was sick with a number of different diseases, and because of Jewish trade in his kingdom, he heard about Jesus. And Jesus was performing miracles, and so he sent Jesus a letter. So this letter is actually preserved in Eusebius's History of the Church. This History of the Church was composed in the later years of Constantine's life, so around 330. And so it has a lot of information. Eusebius, who was a bishop, also claims to have actually seen the original letters that were delivered by royal emissary, a servant sent to find Jesus. And so these letters are very interesting, and they are definitely a part of the story. So this is how the letter of Abgar goes. Abgar to Jesus, who has appeared as a gracious Savior in the region of Jerusalem, greetings. I have heard about you and about the cures you perform without the use of drugs or herbs. If report is true, you make the blind see again and the lame walk about, you cleanse lepers, expel unclean spirits and demons. You cure those suffering from chronic and painful diseases and raise the dead. When I heard all this about you, I concluded that one of two things must be true. Either you are God and came down from heaven to do these things, or you are God's Son doing them. Accordingly, I am writing to beg you to come to me, whatever the inconvenience, and cure the disorder from which I suffer. I may add that I understand the Jews are treating you with contempt and desire to injure you. My city is very small, but highly esteemed and adequate for both of us. And so Abgar asks for to be healed. And he also basically is asking Jesus to come and live in Edessa. And so then there is the letter of response of Jesus to Abgar. Happy are you who believed in me without having seen me. It is written of me that those who have seen me will not believe in me, and that those who have not seen will believe and live. That's a direct paraphrase from the gospel. As to your request that I should come to you, I must complete all that I was sent to do here, and on completing it must at once be taken up to the one who sent me. When I have been taken up, I will send you one of my disciples to cure your disorder and bring life to you and those with you. And that is Jude Thaddeus. So Jude goes to Abgar, and there are a couple of different versions of the story. Some say that that Abgar was healed earlier by the letter that was sent. But generally speaking, Jude is depicted coming to Abgar and bringing with him the image of the face of Christ. And that image then would, so what the tradition is then, since he is a relative of Mary and related to Jesus, that he would have received the shroud and traveled with it to Edessa. And that is the image that we see usually when we see this, the head of Jesus on the napkin. This is also called Veronica's veil, and Veronica's veil is a whole nother story. And it's a little later than this one. So the shroud then finds its way with Jude Thaddeus to the city of Edessa and remains there. And we don't really know what happens. We would imagine that as a relic, there the realities are different because the city is pagan. And so it is not a place of Judaism and Jewish religious laws and traditions. So the relic would be, in a sense, well received and protected there. And in fact, one of the things that historically we're not completely clear on, today Edessa is Urfa in southeastern Turkey. It's an area that has been Muslim for, a good 1400 years. As such, we're limited, we can't really do the archaeological excavations to discover everything that's there. And what is good is in that area, there is a large scale presence of Syriac Christians and many ancient monasteries. And these monasteries, because of the political situation and fear of Islam, they don't share everything that they have, but I'm sure that they are the guardians of many of these missing links in the story. And there are some things which, we do have. We do have, like, for example, a stele. A stele is like a small pillar that tells a story. And there is a stele that shows Abgar with the inscriptions and a piece of cloth with a man's face on it. So there are different things that we have as historical evidence. So, something that would be convincing and would be completely, affirm this historical retelling, that unfortunately we do not have. What we do know, and this is, so when we get farther away from the apostolic age, we begin to actually get a little bit more concrete information. What we do know is that in the year 544, this cloth with the face of Jesus was rediscovered in the walls of the city of Edessa, right close to one of the gates. That's one of the reasons why in many churches, this icon of Christ's face is usually placed close to the doors of the church or above the gate, the entry gate to like a monastery, or in some cases, the gate of a city. So it was discovered there, and we know this because the Byzantines wrote this down, this historical information. And immediately, this image of the face of Christ received certain names. Now, what was it doing in the wall? Well, Edessa was kind of the front line between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. And so every so often the Persians would sweep through, destroy things, take things. And so what happened at one point is that the image must have been put into the wall for safekeeping. And then a number of generations passed before they were safe again. And so it was then 544 when the image was rediscovered, and it was given a number of names. It was called the mandilion, which means imprinted cloth. Now, imprinted is not about the printing press, which did not exist at this time. It's rather about the way that the method that was used to produce the image. So it was, pressed onto the face, the body of Jesus. It was called the akiropitos, which means that which is not made by human hands. And then, most interestingly, it was called the Tetradiplon. And this name means that which is 4 times folded. So what was known to be, or the way it was exhibited, was just the face. It was known to be on a much larger piece of cloth that was folded over various times. We know also that in the year 581, the relic, this image of the face of Christ, was carried into battle by the Byzantine army in defense of their border against the Persians. In the year 622, the Greek poet Thucydides composed a number of hymns that refer to this image specifically, and he calls it the image of the Logos, the icon of the word that formed the universe, that created the universe. But interestingly enough, even in his writings, there is nothing that would tell us that it is the burial shroud of Jesus, because all that was exposed was the face. And so one wonders, did they not know the story that came about, that was created, that is still told, going back to Abgar in Edessa, is that Abgar sent a messenger to Jesus to, convince him to come. He said no. And so Abgar asked for the messenger to paint Jesus's face, because seeing his face, he might be healed. And the messenger had problems getting, the details right and everything. And so Jesus went and he took the cloth, linen for painting, and he pressed it to his face, and his image stayed on it. And so that that comes out of nowhere. Similarly, actually, to like Veronica's veil, it has a very similar genesis. And so, but it does seem, in fact, that a lot of people don't know that it is the burial shroud, even though, as I said, studying history, this is part of the entertainment, even though we get these little hints, the fact that they called it that which is folded 4 times over, it's like, okay, they must have unfolded it at some point. Did they not see the body of Jesus twice reproduced? I mean, there's a lot there. Now, we could say if burning of incense and candles before it, as would have been common, maybe it had darkened it so that was no longer as visible. I don't know. Maybe there was some sort of a cultural taboo thing about it being associated with the burial of Jesus's dead body. I don't know. So we come up with a few answers and still a lot of questions. But the history doesn't end here. So there is a little bit of a jump from the year 622 with Thucydides and his religious poetry. There is a jump because of the iconoclasm and also because of the because of the spread of Islam. And so the next time that we hear about it, at least in historical writings, is in the year 944, when the image of the face of Christ arrives in Constantinople. Now, it could be arriving in Constantinople just because of Islam. When Islam spread throughout the Middle East, so many of the relics and many of the Christians even moved, and they moved towards the areas that were more heavily Christian. And Constantinople is definitely at this point the city and the defender of Christianity in the East. And so in 944, and we know actually on the exact day, on August 15th in the year 944, the image of the face of Christ, the Holy Mandilion, was brought by a man named Theophanes from Edessa. So it had not gone to other places, but was actually in Edessa and came directly from Edessa to Constantinople. And, and we do, it is on the liturgical calendar. In the Byzantine Church, we celebrate the feast of the transferal of the Mandilion on August 16th. So not on August 15th. August 15th is the feast of the Dormition of the Mother of God. And so that takes precedence. And so it is moved back by one day, but it is on our liturgical calendar. And the interesting thing is that, so the resource, it's always interesting when we can line dates up and have eyewitnesses. It's in a time when there were no iPhones and you could not be, filming or taking pictures. It's difficult to get together all of the exact information. But we actually have a text that is in the Vatican Library. It is the Codex Vaticanus Graecus 511, if you want to look it up. And it is a direct eyewitness account and contains the prayer composed by Archdeacon Gregory for the arrival of the Holy Mandilion in Constantinople, delivered to the Emperor Romanos. What is mentioned again is only the face. And so that means that at this point in 944, it was still folded. And so all that is mentioned is the face. And so although this is, sometimes when you try to make that connection, well, is it the shroud? Isn't it the shroud? Those who would like it not to be the shroud, so they say, well, it's not mentioned, so then it's not the shroud. It's probably something else. Maybe it was the piece of cloth that was over the face of Jesus when, that was found separate from the other cloth. But we do have still more information. And so, although that period, we don't hear anything, later on, in the year 1150, a Hungarian delegation comes to the court of Constantinople, and they are permitted to venerate the sacred relic, and they see it completely extended. And so they are the ones. And how do we know this? Well, we know this because an eyewitness account, including a drawing, is preserved in the Codex Prai, which is in the Budapest National Museum. And it is dated to 1192. So it is from that period. So that is, and that's a fascinating little bit of information. So it's like they knew, but what was popularly shown was only the face. So then the history of the shroud begins its westward journey. And on April 12th and 13th in the year 1204, Crusaders attack an unprepared Constantinople, and they proceed to plunder the city. All traces of the shroud disappear. In September of the year 1241, an image is brought to the court of the King of France, Saint Louis IX. And in the notes of this court gathering, it is called Toalla Sancta, which is a holy towel, meaning that it's probably not just the face, but it seems to be a bigger piece of cloth. However, we imagine that it might have been offered to St. Louis to be bought for his collection of relics. He had bought in the year 1239, so 2 years prior, he bought the crown of thorns from King Baldwin II, who was ruling in Constantinople. And then he built the still standing Holy Chapel, Sainte-Chapelle, in Paris to house these relics. And the expense for the relics that he purchased, for the crown of thorns, the building of the chapel, the expense is unimaginable. It was a massive, massive amount compared to like today's understanding. And actually the cost of the relic was more than the building of the building. So, and if you've seen Sainte-Chapelle, it is a masterpiece. So he didn't have money, which would have been my guess, or somebody may have told him, hey, you're gonna have a revolution if you keep on buying these relics. So he did not purchase, or he did not acquire the holy towel, which again we imagine could be the shroud. So, but the shroud doesn't completely disappear. So the first time that the actual, looking at it from today going backwards, the first time that the Shroud of Turin appears clearly And so this is, we already know that this is the same shroud that is today housed in Turin. Is just a couple of years later in the year, well, it's 100 years later, in the year 1353, when it appears in a religious procession in the region of Champagne in the town of Linné. And it is in the hands of the knight Godefroy de Charny. The wife of Godefroy is a direct descendant of Othon de la Roche. Why is this important? Because Othon de la Roche was one of the leaders of the military crusaders who plundered Constantinople. And he specifically plundered the monastery church of Vlaherne. Vlaherne was you could say it was the treasury of the royal family of Constantinople. Vlaherne was the last known place of the shroud. So, okay, there's like 100 and something years between some of these events, but still, I would say that the evidence is rather convincing that there is a real connection between what is the shroud as we know it, all the way back to the burial cloth that was wound around the body of Jesus. Now, I did bring a couple of images to show here. This here is from the Hungarian manuscript. This is the drawing that was part of the eyewitness account of the visit of the Hungarian delegation in 1150 to the court of Constantinople, where they venerated the shroud, and it was extended for them. That looks a lot like the Shroud of Turin, as we see here in a more recent photograph. And here you can also see, the patches, which are those kind of triangular shaped pieces of cloth. Those were the areas that were burned in the fire in the 16th century. And here is the image, the icon of, this is from the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai, and it's an icon from the 10th century showing Abgar receiving the image, because that was the dominant story that was told. And he's receiving it from someone who we don't know if it is Saint Jude Thaddeus or not. But here we see the image, a Baroque image of Jude Thaddeus with the image of Christ, kind of like a medallion on his chest. And then here is a painting that shows the way that the body would have been wrapped. Then here, just so you get an idea of Sainte-Chapelle, this is Sainte-Chapelle. The relic of the crown of thorns, which are these. And then this is a view of Sainte-Chapelle on the outside. There are a number of images that are of the face of Christ that are in Rome and the Vatican. I think the Vatican has even permitted their image to travel as part of like exhibits, because it's thought that these are copies that are based on the original, since all of them are essentially painted. And so they don't exactly have the same look of the Shroud of Turin, where the face is quite different. This is the negative view of the Shroud, which is, I think, the image that most of us are familiar with. It is when it's done in this kind of a grayscale as a negative, that's when we can most clearly see the features. Okay, any questions? I think it was probably out of practicality. Today it's housed in like an enormous frame. It is a metal box that has glass, and the glass is bulletproof, and inside, it's all self-contained. It has its own, cooling and heating so that the temperature is always the same. None of those things were available. And, to even though reliquaries were available and glass could be produced, nothing could be produced that would be that long, to hold that, to contain it. So I think that's probably the first reason, is the practical one. And then secondly, I would think that possibly there was a little bit of a stigma, at least in the beginning, about it being associated with burial. But I think that probably the bigger issue was that people venerated this. And so to have it in a smaller container, it would have probably been in either a metal reliquary, like a box, literally. And they would open up the box, and then people would come and they would touch it, they would kiss it. And so, and if you unwrap the whole thing, you're going to get some people who are very pious and zealous, who are going to be like, I need a little piece of that. And so it's going to be very difficult to keep it, safe. I think there is some evidence that the shroud was cut. And so some of the cut pieces may be the ones that are now, with the paintings. So that could be, because it's a relic of a relic, so it has its own value, even if there isn't the image of Jesus on it. But that's pretty much all we know. And again, you can kind of guess and think, well, maybe because of this, but that would be my guess. I agree. I think that there is still a lot more that we can learn. There are a couple of books out there. There's one that is written it was done a number of years ago by a man named Ian Wilson. And this is a book about kind of Jesus in general, Bible and everything. But he also did one specifically about the Shroud of Turin. And so he goes through a lot of the history there. And he also goes through some of the science, because the science that happened, especially before the 80s, so it was very Italian. It was, not exactly good method, but it did serve a purpose. And so they had a botanist who went, and he came with Scotch tape, and he used the Scotch tape and pressed it on on pieces of the shroud, picking up like little seeds and bugs and larvae and eggs and then he put it onto a under a microscope, and was able to actually say, that this is all, and all of the things that he found were from the journey. So it was Holy Land plus Edessa, South Asia, or Southeastern Europe, and then Constantinople. So it was interesting because he found the whole history there in those little things left behind. The one issue I think with the carbon dating is that they did not realize that because of the fire it was in, that the soot would actually be absorbed into the linen. And so that is what really caused the mistake in the carbon dating. But it's otherwise, I think it's interesting to see how much, similarly with things like with the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, there's so much that we're learning. When you push and pressure and press, which is what was happening with the carbon dating, those efforts usually are not rewarded. It's like, we need to take our time with this, and it needs to be done in a way that is respectful of what we understand as church that this is. It's possible that, something might be proven false or whatever, but I think it's funny. It's when you get so many people who are like, they can't believe that this is from Jesus, and then they believe that Da Vinci did it. It's like, really? There's no proof of that, and it's done in a way that it's a technique which no one has been able to copy or imitate. So and plus the guy I mentioned at the beginning, the Waldemar Yanushchak, so he does have a program about the Renaissance, and he cannot stand Da Vinci, and so it is hilarious. He just rips into him because he said Da Vinci did all these different things, and everybody is saying, oh, it's about flight, and then they show his drawings, and and he did this, and he was he was a modern man and looking forward thinking, blah blah blah. And Yanushchak says, yeah, except if you actually use his drawings, none of this stuff worked. All of it was a hack, it's like, it's a made up thing. If he was actually worth anything, then, he would have been able to make something. And of course, then his big thing is that Da Vinci was also notorious for never having finished anything. Most of his paintings were finished by his students. He was interested for only a time. When he got bored, he moved on. Okay, next week we're going to explore the prayer, the Our Father. I think since it is such a fundamental prayer for every Christian, I think it's important to look into it, unwrap it, and see some of the beautiful texts that are, some of the beautiful words that are used, very deliberately, and they hold much more than what we can perceive. So we will see you next week.